Imagine an ancient human somewhere in Africa, roughly 100,000 years ago. He is in his mid 30s, which in the ancient world makes him a genuinely experienced, highly valuable member of his community. He knows where the water sources are during the dry season. He knows the migration patterns of the local herds. He has survived things that killed younger, stronger men around him. He carries knowledge that his group depends on. He is also, quite possibly, losing his hair. Not from illness, not from malnutrition, just from the same relentless, genetically programmed follicular attrition that has been humbling men at their bathroom mirrors, or, in this case, at the reflective surface of still water, for a very, very long time. His hairline is doing the thing. The temples are receding with a kind of quiet, unstoppable determination. The crown is thinning in a pattern that his own father's head displayed, and his grandfather's before that. And here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. He almost certainly noticed. He lived in a community of people who knew each other intimately, who observed each other constantly, whose social dynamics were as rich and as attentive to personal appearance as any modern community. He saw the reflection of his own face and scalp in water. He ran his hands over his head and registered the change. He had opinions about it in whatever internal vocabulary of self-assessment ancient humans used. Whether those opinions were positive, negative, or completely neutral is one of the more interesting questions we can ask about ancient human psychology. And we will get to that. But first, let's establish something more fundamental. Did ancient humans actually go bald? Not as an assumption, not as a projection of modern patterns onto the past, but as a biological, evolutionary, archaeologically, and genetically grounded fact. The answer is yes. Definitively, fascinatingly, and for reasons that are significantly more interesting than you might expect. Let's start with the genetics because the genetics are where the certainty lives. Male pattern baldness, androgenetic alopecia, to use its clinical name, is one of the most heritable traits in the human genome. Twin studies have shown heritability estimates of approximately 80%, meaning that roughly 80% of the variation in whether a man goes bald and how severely is explained by his genetics rather than his environment. This is an extraordinarily high heritability for a complex trait. For comparison, height, which most people think of as strongly genetic, has a heritability of around 80% as well. Intelligence, as measured by IQ tests, comes in around 50 to 80% depending on the study. Baldness is right up there with the most strongly genetic traits we have. The genetic variants associated with male pattern baldness are not rare, recently mutated oddities. They are common variants, distributed across multiple chromosomes, present at significant frequencies in human populations worldwide. The most important of them are located on the X chromosome, which is why the maternal grandfather is a better predictor of male baldness than the paternal grandfather, since men inherit their X chromosome from their mother, who got it from her father. But there are also significant contributors on autosomes, non-sex chromosomes, that are not sex-linked and that contribute to baldness risk regardless of which parent they came from. These variants are old. Ancient DNA research has confirmed the presence of baldness-associated genetic variants in ancient human remains going back tens of thousands of years, with the allele frequencies broadly consistent with what we see in modern populations. This is not a recent mutation. This is not something that developed with modern diet, modern stress, or modern anything. It is a feature of the human genome that was already in place in ancient populations, producing baldness in ancient men at rates broadly comparable to modern rates. Male pattern baldness affects approximately 50% of men by age 50 in modern populations, with significant variation by ancestry. It was doing roughly the same thing in ancient populations. 1 in 2 ancient men over 50 was dealing with significant hair loss. This is not a marginal phenomenon. It is a standard feature of the ancient male experience. Now, here is the question that actually makes this biologically interesting. Why? Natural selection is, at its core, a filter. Traits that reduce reproductive success get filtered out of populations over time. Traits that increase reproductive success get amplified. Traits that are genuinely neutral, neither helping nor hurting, tend to persist if they are not too costly, but they do not become as prevalent as baldness is without some reason. Male pattern baldness is highly heritable, quite prevalent, and associated with real biological costs. Increased risk of sunburn on the scalp, increased thermal regulation challenges in both hot and cold environments, and in some studies, modest associations with other health conditions. A trait like this, with real costs and no obvious benefits, should have been reduced in frequency over evolutionary time if it were purely neutral, and should have been eliminated much faster if it were significantly costly. And yet, here it is. Present in half of all men over 50. Clearly ancient, clearly heritable. What is going on? There are several competing hypotheses, and the honest answer is that evolutionary biology has not definitively settled this question. But the most compelling explanations are interesting enough to walk through. The first is the sexual selection hypothesis. This proposes that baldness in the evolutionary environment in which human mate preferences developed was associated with positive qualities that outweighed its aesthetic costs. The most developed version of this argument focuses on the association between baldness and perceived dominance and social status. A number of psychological studies have found that bald men are rated as more dominant, more authoritative, and in some contexts more socially powerful than non-bald men, despite being rated as less physically attractive on average. In a social hierarchy where status and dominance translated into access to resources and mates, which is exactly the kind of social hierarchy that ancient humans lived in, appearing more dominant could be a genuine reproductive advantage. There is also the testosterone connection, which is one of the most commonly cited aspects of male pattern baldness. Dihydrotestosterone, a metabolite of testosterone, is the primary hormonal driver of androgenetic alopecia in men who are genetically susceptible. Men who go bald are not necessarily producing more testosterone than men who don't, but they have follicles that are more sensitive to DHT, causing those follicles to miniaturize over time. The association between baldness and testosterone, even if not a direct causal one, may have created a perceptual heuristic in ancient mate assessment. A bald man signals high androgen activity, which is associated with masculine physical development, immune function, and competitive ability. In an environment where male quality was genuinely difficult to assess from a distance, visible cues that correlated with testosterone-related traits would have carried information. The second major hypothesis is the honest signaling of age hypothesis, and this one I find particularly compelling. In the ancient world, age and experience were enormously valuable. A man who had survived to his 40s or 50s had done something genuinely difficult, navigated decades of physical danger, resource scarcity, social complexity, and the grinding attrition of ancient life. He had accumulated knowledge that younger men simply did not have. His survival itself was evidence of competence. His experience was a community resource. In this context, a visible signal of age and male pattern baldness is precisely that. Appearing reliably in midlife and progressing visibly over time could function as an honest signal of accumulated experience. Not just this man is old, but this man is old enough to have survived a lot, which means he knows things. In social animals where information and knowledge are community resources, visible markers that correlate with knowledge accumulation could carry genuine social value. This is consistent with the observation that baldness peaks in mid to late life rather than early life. It does not make young men look old before they have the experience to back it up. It emerges roughly in synchrony with the period when men's accumulated experience and social value is genuinely increasing. That timing is consistent with a signaling function. The third hypothesis is the least glamorous but possibly the most important: genetic linkage. The genes associated with male pattern baldness do not only affect hair follicles. They are involved in androgen receptor activity and signaling pathways that affect multiple tissues and functions throughout the body. Some of these other effects may have been strongly positively selected for in ancient environments, and the baldness came along for the ride as a side effect. What evolutionary biologists call a pleiotropic effect, where one gene affects multiple traits. If the androgen receptor variants that cause baldness also contribute to muscle development, immune function, bone density, or any number of other traits that were directly relevant to ancient survival and reproductive success, then those variants could have been maintained at high frequency by selection on those other traits, regardless of the effect on hair. This is not a fully satisfying answer to the question of why baldness persists. It is more of an answer to why it was not eliminated. The trait persists because it is genetically linked to other things that matter, or because it carries its own social signals that matter, or some combination of both. Evolution is not clean. It does not produce perfectly optimized organisms with no vestigial traits, no linked effects, no trade-offs. It produces organisms that are good enough at surviving and reproducing, with all the accumulated compromises that entails. Male pattern baldness is almost certainly a compromise. Ancient men went bald for the same reasons modern men go bald, and those reasons are written in the ancient architecture of human genetics. Now let's talk about female hair loss, because androgenetic alopecia does not only affect men, and the female version of this story is both different and equally interesting. Female pattern hair loss affects approximately 50% of women by age 80, with a significant proportion experiencing noticeable thinning by their 50s and 60s. It presents differently than male pattern baldness. Diffuse thinning across the top of the scalp rather than the dramatic recession and crown loss characteristic of male androgenetic alopecia. But it is driven by the same underlying genetic and hormonal mechanisms. Ancient women experienced this too. The same genetic variants, the same androgenetic mechanisms, the same progressive hair thinning in midlife and beyond. An ancient woman in her 60s, if she was fortunate enough to reach that age, was almost certainly dealing with a noticeably thinner head of hair than she had in her 20s. Given the social and symbolic significance of hair in virtually every human culture that has been studied, a significance we will discuss in more detail shortly, this was not a trivial aspect of ancient female experience. The fact that female pattern hair loss is less visually dramatic than the male version, and that it typically progresses more slowly and begins later, is probably not accidental from an evolutionary perspective. Hair in women carries significant mate attraction value in cross-cultural studies of physical attractiveness. Thick, healthy hair is one of the most consistently rated positive physical traits in women across cultures, and its association with reproductive age and health is direct enough that evolutionary psychologists have argued it functions as a reliable signal of fertility and health status. Strong selection pressure against dramatic female hair loss would be expected to produce a more gradual, less visible pattern of age-related thinning in women than in men, which is exactly what we observe. Let's talk about ancient hair care, because this connects directly to the bald question in a way that is genuinely fascinating. Ancient humans cared about their hair, not in a vain, superficial way, in a survival-relevant, socially significant, culturally embedded way that we can actually trace in the archaeological record. The earliest evidence of deliberate grooming tools in the archaeological record predates any specific grooming technology by its presence as modified bone and antler implements, whose wear patterns are consistent with use in detangling and arranging hair. Archaeological sites from ancient periods regularly yield small pointed implements made from bone, antler, and sometimes ivory that have been identified as possible hair picks or combs, objects whose form and scale suggest a function in hair management rather than hunting or food processing. We also have evidence of the use of animal fats and plant-based oils as hair treatments in ancient contexts. The presence of lipid residues on ancient implements and on the scalps of well-preserved ancient human remains, where they survive, suggests that hair was regularly treated with fat-based preparations. This would have served practical purposes. Animal fat applied to hair reduces water loss, protects against insect infestation, eases tangling, and in cold climates provides modest additional insulation. But it almost certainly also served aesthetic and social purposes, since groomed hair in virtually every documented human culture carries significant social signaling value. The ochre, the red iron oxide pigment that appears in ancient sites across the globe from at least 160,000 years ago, has been proposed as a possible hair colorant in some ancient contexts. Some researchers have suggested that the application of ochre to hair was one of its functions in ancient communities, providing a distinctive visual marker of group identity or personal status. This remains speculative, but it is consistent with the wide range of uses documented for ochre in ancient contexts. All of this grooming attention makes the hair loss question more socially significant, not less. In communities that cared enough about hair to develop tools for managing it, to apply fat based preparations to it, and possibly to color it, the progressive loss of hair would have been a noticed and socially meaningful event. Here is something that most people have never thought about: the paradox of ancient human body hair. Humans are one of the only large mammals that is largely hairless over most of the body. We have more hair follicles per square centimeter of skin than chimpanzees, but our body hair is so fine and sparse that we appear effectively naked compared to other primates. This is a recent evolutionary development. Our earliest ancestors, going back millions of years, were covered in the kind of dense body hair that characterizes other great apes. Somewhere in the lineage that led to modern humans, body hair was dramatically reduced. The leading hypothesis for why body hair was reduced is thermoregulation during high-intensity activity in hot, open environments. Ancient hunter-gatherers pursuing game across open African savanna under the equatorial sun generate enormous amounts of metabolic heat. A body covered in dense fur retains that heat, leading to dangerous hyperthermia, overheating. A largely hairless body with a dramatically increased density of eccrine sweat glands, which is exactly what modern humans have, far more than any other primate, can dissipate heat through sweating with extraordinary efficiency, allowing sustained high-intensity activity in hot environments that would overheat a furred competitor. But if body hair was being reduced for thermoregulatory reasons, why was head hair retained? Why do modern humans have a thick head of hair when the rest of the body is essentially naked? The answer is almost certainly solar protection. The head is the body part most directly and persistently exposed to direct solar radiation during upright bipedal activity. The brain is the most metabolically sensitive organ in the body, with an extraordinarily narrow temperature tolerance. Even small increases in brain temperature impair function dramatically. A thick head of hair on a largely hairless body provides insulation against radiant heat on exactly the organ that most needs protection from it, while allowing the rest of the body to dissipate metabolic heat through sweating. This is the functional context in which male pattern baldness becomes evolutionarily interesting. The retention of head hair was presumably selected for because of its solar protection function. Yet, here is a heritable trait that progressively removes that protection from a significant proportion of adult men. If head hair was that important for solar protection, why wasn't baldness selected against more strongly? One answer is that the benefits associated with baldness, whatever they were, in terms of status signaling or linkage to other positively selected traits, outweighed the solar protection cost, particularly in environments where ancient humans had behavioral adaptations like sheltering during peak sun hours, using plant or hide coverings for the head, or simply spending less time in direct sun as they aged and became less involved in high-intensity pursuit hunting. An older, higher status man whose baldness signaled his age and dominance was probably not running for hours in the midday sun the way younger hunters were. His solar protection needs were lower. The cost of his baldness was correspondingly reduced. Let's talk about what ancient people thought about baldness, because this is the most human dimension of the question, and the one that requires the most inference. We cannot know directly what ancient humans thought about baldness because they left no written record. But we can make reasonable inferences from several sources. The first is comparative anthropology. The attitudes of traditional cultures toward baldness, documented in ethnographic research across dozens of societies, show enormous variation. Some cultures associated baldness in men with virility, strength, and masculine power, consistent with the testosterone association hypothesis. Some associated it with wisdom and the authority of age, consistent with the honest signaling hypothesis. Some treated it as a neutral feature of aging with no particular valence. Very few traditional cultures, in their documented forms before contact with the specific cultural frameworks that produced modern Western anxieties about hair loss, showed the kind of strongly negative evaluation of male baldness that contemporary Western culture has normalized. This is worth pausing on. The idea that baldness is unambiguously and obviously something to be embarrassed about, to be concealed, to be treated and reversed at significant expense, that attitude is a historically specific cultural product, not a universal human response to hair loss. Ancient humans encountering baldness in their community members may well have understood it primarily as a marker of age and experience, carrying the same ambivalent respect that age carries in communities where experience is genuinely valued. The second source is what we know about ancient human social values. In communities where survival required deep ecological knowledge accumulated over decades, where the memories of elders stored information the entire community depended on, where age itself was a form of achievement, the visible markers of age would carry a different social weight than they do in a culture that fetishizes youth and treats aging as primarily a process of decline. An ancient man whose balding scalp announced his age to everyone who saw him was announcing something that, in his community, was genuinely worth announcing. There is one more angle here that I want to cover, because it reframes the entire question in an unexpected way. The genetics of hair, its texture, its color, its growth patterns, its susceptibility to loss, are among the most variable features of the human genome, with significant differences across ancestral populations reflecting different evolutionary histories and selective pressures. The frequency of baldness-associated variants varies meaningfully across populations. East Asian populations have historically lower rates of male pattern baldness than European or South Asian populations. African populations show intermediate rates. These differences are genetic, ancient, and reflect different evolutionary trajectories in different environments. What this population variation tells us is that the selection pressures operating on baldness were not identical across all ancient human populations. Different ancient populations living in different environments with different social structures and different mate preference patterns experienced different intensities of selection for and against baldness-associated variants. The result is a global distribution of baldness that reflects this heterogeneous ancient history. Ancient humans in tropical Africa, the evolutionary homeland of our species, experienced whatever selective pressures first established the basic genetic architecture of human hair, including baldness susceptibility. Ancient humans who migrated to higher latitudes encountered different solar environments, less intense radiation, different seasonal patterns that changed the thermoregulatory calculus of both body hair and head hair retention. Ancient humans in East Asia apparently evolved in a context where baldness-associated variants were less positively selected or more negatively selected than in South Asia or Europe, producing the lower modern frequency of baldness in those populations. This is the actual evolutionary complexity of human baldness. It is not a simple, single story. It is a family of related stories playing out in different ancient populations under different conditions, producing the global variation in baldness patterns that we observe today.